Hello and welcome to Terrible Business Advice, the show where bad advice gets a second chance, epic failures turn into brilliant lessons, and business wisdom comes with a side serving of humour. In each episode, we chat with a business leader or entrepreneur about the worst advice they've ever received and uncover surprising lessons hidden behind the nonsense. My guest for this first episode is Jeremy Blain, CEO of PerformanceWorks International, Transformational Leadership and Digital Acceleration expert, and author of the #1 bestseller, Unleash the Inner CEO. He also hosts the Rethink Leadership podcast that ranks high in the top 1.5% of podcasts globally. And if that wasn't enough, he's co-founder of social enterprise at Diversity Talent and an international keynote speaker. Okay, so welcome, Jeremy. Thanks for joining us today.
Fantastic to be with you, Neil. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, me too. It's the first one, so let's hope we have lots of fun with this. So over the years, you've given lots of advice to lots of people, including me, and of course, it's all brilliant advice. Yeah, but you're not here to talk about that. You're here to talk about a piece of terrible business advice. So what is it?
The customer's always right. So that was the advice when I started my career in the 90s. That was the mantra in the organization. And this piece of advice, I would say, is really important for those at the beginning of their career, moving into middle management, etc. With experience, I think you learn about this and the realities and how to deal with it. But at first, that got me into a bit of hot water.
All right. So do you want to tell us a story about that, about how you took that advice and then, it didn't really work out for you?
Well, not really, Neil, no. but I will anyway.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yes, yeah, but let's think of this as a cleansing experience for me. One of the many. So I joined, my career started with working with Procter & Gamble and then into PepsiCo. So it's consumer led. And the customers had a lot of power within that as well, regardless of what the brand was. And I was working for two companies who had two big brands, of course, or multiple brands. But this was the mantra, not only from my bosses, and I think now I reflect back my inexperienced bosses that I worked for, but also for me at the beginning of my career, is that, so what did I want to do? I was in sales. And I was in sales operations, graduated to that too. Well, I want to succeed. Those were the days when it's about promotion. It's about what you achieve. It's about that was the all driving. I feel that's very different now in many ways. Now is more about, if I look at myself and also the generations coming into the workplace, more about meaningful work, fulfilling work. Yes, I want to be successful, but it doesn't trump everything else. For me, though, success did. So that piece of advice about was as much as self-talk as it was around the manager who I was working for, who was telling me it's about the customer. I think what he meant was that we need to be customer orientated, and that's fine. We do. But the customer isn't always right. So the piece of hot water that I got into was with a company in the UK called Woolworths, which ultimately failed, actually. Not my fault.
I remember it very well, yes.
Yeah. So Woolies or Woolworths, for those listening in Australia, it's still there. Woolies is still alive and kicking. Different company, though. And it was my first key account management role in sales. This was for PepsiCo, and I wanted to prove myself, and I was proving myself against the grocery teams, those working with the big supermarkets in the UK, the big wholesalers in the UK, and Woolworths was seen as quite a small player in that, but it had huge potential with it, which it never quite realized. Being on the high street, I was selling crisps or chips and snacks at the time. And these are impulse buys. So for me, it was all about success. And this, because for me, it was all about making the customer happy first so that they would give me what I want, the promotions that I wanted. They would put me on the end displays as you walked into the into the side. They put our products by the till so people would pick them up as they went. I made too many compromises, Neil. And those
Because
compromises,
you were saying they were always right, so they can't,
yeah,
they can't
that's right.
question what you're doing.
Exactly right. And so they would say, well, yeah, but you need to pay us more for this, or I need you to do this for us. We need to go beyond the discounts that you're giving to Tesco, to Sainsbury's, to all of these things. And for me, I bent over backwards to try and do that, which got me in hot water. Not only with then, because I wasn't even thinking about that with other customers. So the feedback to the rest of the organization was, what the heck's going on with Woolworths? They sell less crisps than a bakery down the road. We sell £1 million worth, and you're giving them these discounts. So that got me into big trouble.
Yeah. And I suppose in a way that, that's one of the flaws of the advice, isn't it? That unless you're going to support your staff in this situation where they're bending over backwards to try and accommodate this customer, then, it's not going to work. So yeah, I think it's I would agree. I mean, it's on the face of it, it's bad advice. I mean, do you know anybody who is always right? I mean, who is always correct about things? Nobody,
apart from me.
Nobody, well, apart from you, obviously. Yeah.
No,
And me to an extent.
No, and this is why I know that you really got me on as the first guest, because I've given lots of terrible advice and learned from it, fortunately. But no, I don't know, Neil, and that's it. And so, but it was the double whammy for me of the advice that I mistook from my management, I would have to admit, but also the self-talk, the advice to myself at that point around, no, I've got to do everything that the customer wants and it'll all be absolutely fantastic. And I'll look and, I'll win, I'll do this and that and the other. And it was totally wrong. And that experience alone suddenly stopped me in my tracks, because then I was getting my own business criticizing me. I was getting the other companies with the other account managers criticizing me and being asked why I did this, and it didn't cut it. Well, the customer's always right? And that's when I learned that more experienced leaders and managers said, I'm sorry, no.
So they got it. Do you know where this came from? Do you know where this advice originated?
Do you mean the customer's always right?
Yeah.
No, I don't. Do you?
Right. Yes, I did a little bit of research before we came on the podcast today, and I found out that actually nobody really knows exactly who coined this, but a lot of people attribute it to somebody called Marshall Field. Now, he was a department store owner in Chicago at the turn of the 20th century. And he came up with this piece of advice: the customer is always right, because he thought that was important. But he also had a few other phrases. Do you want to hear another one?
Yes, please.
That hasn't quite made the cut to the 21st century, and you might see why. But another phrase that he came up with was, give the lady what she wants. So that's another piece of advice that he's given. So I'm not quite sure we can trust Marshall Field. But anyway, this was popularized by people like Caesar Ritz, who founded the Ritz hotels, now the Ritz-Carlton, so luxury 5-star hotels. Same with Harry Selfridge of Selfridge's fame. He popularized this idea as well. But it wasn't long actually before there was pushback on this idea, which is, to us these days, it is clearly flawed. And I've got a quote here from somebody called Frank Farrington. And he wrote back in 1914, he was criticizing this idea that was going everywhere, when the equivalent of viral in the early 1900s. And he wrote in a publication called Mill Supplies, which sounds exciting, doesn't it? But anyway, he was worried that this view ignores that customers can be dishonest. They have unrealistic expectations or try to misuse a product in ways that void the guarantee. And what he wrote was this. He said, if we adopt the policy of admitting whatever claims the customer makes to be proper, and if we always settle them at face value, we shall be subjected to inevitable losses. If the customer is made perfectly to understand what it means for him to be right, what right on his part is, then he can be depended on to be right if he is honest. But if he is dishonest, a little effort should result in catching him at it. So in that sort of Victorian eloquence, that's pretty much what we've been saying, isn't it?
Yeah, if you don't mind, just come back up to that, because it with experience, of course, you realize it's a total nonsense, in fact, because it makes a mockery of negotiation, for example, if you're doing this. So for me, I would reiterate the point is that there are many people like Marshall Field, like Caesar Ritz, etc., and Frank Farrington, who get it, and I get it now. You get it now, and we're experienced. We're senior. We know how to have these conversations. The problem is I don't think that is dripping through still the business, and we're not training it. We're not helping inexperienced customer-facing staff deal with those situations when clearly there is a challenge to be faced on the other side of the table.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think we're going to come to this in a little bit later. When we turn this piece of bad advice into good advice, and I think training people how to deal with these situations when, the customer is perhaps being dishonest or, they're not being correct. But first of all, I just want to look at the consequences of this piece of advice. So if we tell our employees, look, the customer is always right, you've got to bend over backwards to make sure that you accommodate every request that they have. What do you think are the consequences on the ground of them taking advice? You've already given us an example of a problem you had, when you got criticized. But, I'm thinking here of employee morale, and how that can be problematic if they're having to deal with customers who are unreasonable or even abusive.
Yeah. And some are. It is the power dynamic. It's where is the power balance? Where is the perceived power or the expressed power versus the real power in that? And I think those of us who feel that we're in a weaker position must always remember that it's not as weak as you might think, and it may even be stronger. And there is always a balancing argument. And my example just actually is a microcosm of this question that you raise, is that you can start to lose money. So I gained in Woolies. Of course I gained because I gave away the earth. But that also meant our margin was much smaller. So it wasn't really a gain. But the biggest impact is some of the other customers around in the business, whether it's wholesale, retail, whatever, or food service, is that they reduced their orders or they started negotiating for better deals. So the knock-on impact is that I directly impacted the bottom line of the organization. And no wonder I didn't get fired, actually, Neil, if I look at it now, but particularly the numbers that we're looking at, which I am not going to repeat here, for sure. So is that there? And of course, then with employees internally, it's, you start breaking away the team. It's like silo. What is that team doing? And what is that Jeremy doing? How on earth does he think he can do that without consulting with us over here? Because he's trying to make a name for himself? What? And they were right, of course. I just wanted to prove myself. It wasn't about I wanted to be better than everybody else. I definitely wanted to succeed and so on. But I made an absolutely poor, immature, naive, bad call. Fortunately, that was quite early in my career, and I've never made that mistake again.
Right. So you learned from it, didn't you? And you now know that the customer is not always right. But I think the issue becomes more serious, doesn't it, when people are expected to put up with abuse or trying to, deal with customers who are not being reasonable and then trying to bend over backwards to accommodate their request, which is humiliating for the staff as well. So if they don't have your back as a manager, and you're constantly telling them that the customer is always right, you've got to do what they want. That's just going to lead to all sorts of problems. I mean, as well as the bottom line, you've got staff morale, and obviously what that leads to is people leaving, and then you have to retrain and all those kind of things. So I think you touched on this as well, that good customers suffer as well, don't they? Because you're not offering a consistent service. Some people are getting away with something, and you might not be offering it to somebody else. So do you think that's another issue that we should consider?
Well, yes, and that relates to what I said there, is that so some of those way, 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 way bigger customers who were then looking in because they can see it, it's right there, it's immediate, saying, why is that company that sells, over 10 times less or less than 10 times of a tenth of what I sell, getting a deal that you have not given me? So the first thing I want you to do is give me that deal. Otherwise, we're freezing orders.
Right.
Now, and
And
when
they've
you're
got
talking about millions, Neil, that is a big worry, and that's where it sort of can start to destroy my. Now I'm talking about it now, I'm thinking, how on earth did I not get fired? But anyway, it's like, thank goodness I was a fast learner. But that's really key, and therefore, and I didn't feel, at the time, that when I suddenly realized what was going on, it was like I was thinking, well, why didn't my boss at the time say something or give me some different? There was no way I was going to say, yeah, but he said X. Of course, I wouldn't be doing that. But for me, I felt a little bit let down in that. And I also felt that why didn't those senior leaders sort of engage with me a little bit earlier as well, give me some advice, give me that I was talking about that would happen. So it put me in a really weak position in the organization, almost having to double prove myself again, to do that and make roll up. But there are a couple of other things just to have in mind here. First of all, the risk is, and the danger was, and the reality became that I set a precedent with that customer. You've done that before, so now we want it now. Now the conversation gets even more tricky because I've got to say no to a client that I've already said yes to in another situation, and that, that can go completely the other way. And then then where are we? And so on. But it toughens you up a little bit, and you've got to be prepared to have those conversations too. But I think that is one element of it, which is something that you've really got to understand. And the second element is that what I'm giving them in no way returned what I was promised from them. So this wasn't a mutual relationship. This is a power play. And this was, you give me all that and I'll decide what I then do. So, like I said, it was less margin and we sold way less than was predicted. So it was even worse.
Yeah. And the customer's always going to try and get the most out of the deal. And if they sense a weakness somewhere, and this is you trying to sort of bend over backwards to accommodate them, then they're gonna play with that sometimes, aren't they? They're not always.
And I was weak. I was weak. I was not confident to stand up, particularly if they brought somebody else in. So I had my buyer, but if they brought in the head of buying or a director of procurement, I'd be really I don't know, I'd be less confident when there was hierarchy in the room as well, particularly if they didn't say anything. And of course, what I know now is it's a whole negotiation play. It's an act. And it's like, I mean, I train it now.
Yeah. I mean, and this is, probably taking us to how we turn this around, because, this podcast is not just about pulling apart the bad advice, but how do we take the essence of this advice, the kind of nugget of wisdom that's hidden there, and make it sort of relevant to real life and something which is useful. So I think for me, the first thing that you need to do, like you mentioned before, is just train your staff how to deal with these situations when they arise, how to sort of stand firm sometimes when customers have been quite demanding, how to deal with difficult customers who are perhaps on the verge of being abusive, and to take that action. I mean, it's interesting. I was reading about a company called Nordstrom. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. They're a retail company.
Nordstrom,
yeah, they're quite famous, and they're famous for their customer service. And they've got this 12-page staff handbook. And one phrase stands out, and it's been shared quite a lot. And they just are advised: use your best judgment in all situations. There will be no additional rules. Now, I know this is a big part of what you do, isn't it? Talking about empowering staff at all levels and giving them that decision-making ability and capability. So I think, when you're training them, you also need to bear that in mind. How much responsibility are you going to give them to make decisions on discounts and on how much abuse they can put up with before they can turn around to the customer and shut it down somehow. So I'd say that's one of the things that, you need to do really in order to accommodate customers that are not always right. But what about others? Have you got any other suggestions?
Yeah, from experience, a few to add to the mix. Make it less personal and about the person. So I was wowed by the title, the confidence of the person, the power that was being wielded, whatever that was. So you have to take that away, and therefore you have to be more skilled in dealing with that. And and you're exactly right. It's the skill sets that you were just talking about there. That's what we need to focus on. Conflict management, open communication, forensic questioning, active and empathetic listening. All of these things need to be upgraded within our people. And then you're on much more solid ground to be really tough on the issues rather than the person. So it's not about opinions either. You need to have your facts straight. You need to have the data that proves your point of view. And this is something else I didn't have then. I didn't have numbers that were readily available. That's what I've learned to do it. So when I'm challenging back, I can be really tough on the issues because I've got the data to prove it. So it becomes less personal in that respect as well. You have to be prepared to say no. And I'm now comfortable in saying no, but in a very polite way these days. And I always look for balance. So, and I do still, even with my experience, of course we do, I still come across heads of procurement, which are now being brought in because they need to manage suppliers better, or, service providers and professional service providers like us. They don't know me, and they're coming into a negotiation with me, and they're using tactics that like they do with somebody that's not experienced. And it just absolutely exposes them because I know how to handle those now. And so, I had a great example, even just last year, of this very proud negotiator who came on. She was very, very good at what she did. She was head of procurement for this major manufacturing organization. She was known as being very, very tough and getting discounts off people. And she said, right, I see now that you, with this team, you've agreed with our, whoever it was, that you're going to do this extra instead of giving a discount. You'll put these bits extra in, whatever it was, something like that. And she said, but I'm afraid that we have a policy now that we're looking for a 12% discount following this from every supplier. And I said, okay, so what are you willing to put on the table in return? Well, we'll give you the contract. No, the contract was verbally given to me based on our original. So I'm willing to give you a further 12% discount, but you have to give me another year of the contract. Are you willing to do that? Oh, well, I can't, blah, 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 blah. And suddenly the power shifted. And so the other thing that I've learned is to be calm and use pauses and not be flustered within this, because what happened is that I took off the veneer of this person, and I found underneath that it was a power play. There wasn't any substance underneath with data, with whatever. So, and then I had the numbers to my fingertips. If you're asking me for this is essentially what you're asking for. And as a professional services consultant, you're asking me to do the job because I'm the best for it. That's why I've been selected. If you truly believe that I'm going to add this much value to your client, then why wouldn't you do that for 2 years instead of 1? And so we agreed at the end of it, well, let's just keep it to 1 year and we'll keep it to what you've agreed. Yeah.
And of course, just going back to the advice, I mean, if you say the customer is always right, there's no negotiation, is there? Because exactly, it's just, right. They tell you what they want, and then you just say yes, which is never going to work, is it? So that's another reason why it's flawed.
And I would always say, though, that knowing this person, had I have met her earlier in my career, it would have been, yes, mum, I'll see what I can do for you. And that is, I think it goes back to something we said right at the beginning, Neil, which is this is why we need a repurposed line management who stops supervising what we're doing day to day and start supporting it better, which is the management job, by coaching and actually being more collaborative on preparing for these things, so that we upskill the ground up from our organization, so that we've got people who are more confident to have these kind of conversations.
And I think you kind of touched on this earlier as well, that we should set clear policies. So think about all the different situations that your staff are going to be put in, and make sure that they have the policies to back them up. Because I picked up something which I find interesting about not making this personal. And sometimes, especially when we get into a bit of a conflict situation, we naturally become a little bit more personal, and that makes things worse, doesn't it? But if you've got a set of facts and data and policies that you can, clearly thought out and that you have there to refer to, then that makes the process of dealing with this customer a bit smoother, I think. Because ultimately, we don't want to lose the customer, do we? We want to retain the customer normally, unless they're really horrible and abusive or ask for too much, and they're really, not realistic most of the time. So, but if we have those clear policies in mind, and we know, maybe we've done some research before we go in, and we know exactly what we're able to give away, then that helps as well, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, and actually going in, not giving anything away is probably the best. It is probably the best element, but knowing where we can move to for sure. But bizarrely, it's really interesting, this, Neil, because by doing what I did for that client, I didn't then appear to be their great hope and, oh, this is a supplier, you're our favorite supplier because you give us these amazing discounts. I was just seen as a weak person that they could use. Bizarrely, when the shoe's on the other foot, like with this person who I have a really good relationship with, by the way, right now, and she's a lot of fun, but she's extremely good at her job, is that you start to build more respect and more mutual respect actually within the relationship. So it deepens the relationship when you're able to have tough business conversations in a way that is a bit more collaborative and a bit more fair.
Yeah. And I think that's how we sort of turn this around a little bit. So rather than saying the customer is always right, the customer deserves respect. And, ideally they show that back to you, in response. So yes, I think there's various things that we can do to sort of turn this into good advice and recognize, of course, the obvious flaw that people are not always right. And I think finally, with this, you need to be able to protect your team as well as a manager. They need to know you've got their back, so that if they have to make difficult decisions, maybe you've empowered them to do that. At least you're going to support them.
Yeah, and that's my point before around performance supervision versus performance support, and the fact that we don't need line managers who become super versions of the operational thing that they've maybe just been promoted from, because that's what we're being guilty, particularly in sales, I might add, is where somebody's been very good at sales and then promoted into management. It doesn't make them a good manager. It makes them somebody who can maybe in the short term solve problems, go and get that big sale, but they're never growing the organization underneath them. They're becoming just the champion and moving things forward faster because we need short term now, but we've got long term goals too. We don't have time for all of this. Well, yes, we do have time for this. We need to have time for that so that we're growing our base. Otherwise, we're just going to have less and less capable managers coming into our organization. And that's no good for your customers. It's no good for your employees, and it's no good for you.
Right. Absolutely. And totally agree with that. And again, going back to the advice, it just reflects the flaw in it, doesn't it? I mean, if you're going to tell people like young Jeremy was when you worked for was it the crisp company you were working for?
Yeah, it was Frito-Lay. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So, poor young Jeremy is told the customer is always right. And now we've got a wealth of experience that tells us the opposite. Almost. Well, not the opposite. I mean, because obviously customers are usually right, aren't they? But sometimes they could be wrong. And recognizing that, I think, is an important part of the process.
Right, Neil. I'll go with that.
Oh, it's all right.
Okay. I think we have to approach this from a very positive and personable thing, is that we've all got a point of view here. The customer knows their business better than I do. So therefore, they're going to be more right than wrong when they're explaining that to us, for sure. Yeah. When we're coming to what happens with our product, we've got to understand that we've got that level of power too. We understand our product or service better. We also can add value by challenging their thinking around what the real needs are here. So I used a retail example, but particularly for B2B, when it's around services, it's like, what are the real needs? You might be asking for this, but what's the driver behind it? So you start to add value from day one, and you start to build that collaborative relationship. So we can all be right and we can all be wrong, but together we're right more of the time.
Yeah. And just recognizing when we're wrong and trying to persuade the other person that that's the case in a polite and professional way is the way forward, isn't it? Yeah. Brilliant. Okay. Well, I think we've covered that ground quite a lot there, haven't we? We've got lots of good advice from Jeremy there on how to
Oh,
turn this around.
good one.
But just as a sort of fun way to end the podcast, I want to sort of turn this around a little bit. And as I said at the beginning, you've given lots of advice to people, and there's a piece of advice perhaps that you've given that you wish you hadn't now with the benefit of experience. So what's that?
I've given lots of terrible advice.
No, well, I know. It's not all of it.
But I actually, so I was talking about when I was a sales rep, but when I had my first management roles, I was quite guilty of that because I was still customer facing, whether it was in trade marketing, sales operations, or sales, or category management, which was still retail back then. And it's funny, that same feeling there. I'm the manager of these teams. I can come in and see that customer and I can iron things out or do things or whatever, or just protect the business that we've got across the whole team. So the piece of advice that I regret giving earlier on in my managerial position was don't rock the boat. Is that, this customer is a key customer of ours. Don't rock the boat. They've got this is the personality of this one. Don't say this, don't say that, don't do it because it could jeopardize us. I mean, what nonsense. It's like if I knew then what I know now, I'd have been a much better manager in my first managerial roles. Because we're not doing anything. It's not about challenging necessarily the customer or the client. It's about adding value or even creating value by going deeper than maybe just sort of general reps might go. We should become trusted advisors, consultants. So I was doing exactly what I was saying before that managers shouldn't do, which is almost getting in the way of developing our people into growth, saying, you just stick to the sales bit, I'll just make sure it's all smooth on the water. And I'd spent no time developing them and developing their skills to create and add value, to have more challenging conversations. And something that I do regret, but again, I regretted only for the short term because I learned quickly from it.
Right. And how would you rephrase that these days with the benefit of your experience? If you were to give that advice again, but in a better way.
Yeah, it would be prepared to challenge.
Yeah.
So be prepared to challenge opinion, the status quo, that whatever it is, but stick to the issues, don't make it personal, have the data and the evidence, and from a management perspective, let's role play it first and let's see if we can make it even better and let me support you through it.
Brilliant. Yeah. So sometimes rocking the boat in a positive way can actually be beneficial, can't it?
It can. And in fact, yes, rock the boat, but do it in so yes, be challenging, but
yes.
And
brilliant. Okay, well, thanks very much, Jeremy. That was really good. I enjoyed that conversation. I think we've really pulled that piece of terrible advice apart, and a good one to start with, I think, because it's amazing how ubiquitous it is. I mean, it's everywhere. It has permeated every society, every culture. I was talking to a waiter here in Malaysia, where I'm based. And he was telling me about, some of the customers that come into the cafe and they complain about trivial things or things that are out of their control. Like, for example, just having to wait a bit longer because they're very busy, they're very full, and they're having to wait a few minutes. And then he said, but the customer is always right. And I thought, yeah, it's everywhere, this thing. And of course, it's just not, is it? Customers are not always right in those circumstances. You've got to recognize that sometimes in busy periods, it's going to take a bit longer to get service. So,
Sorry, go on.
No, but so it just made me think, it's everywhere. This idea, this piece of advice, and we're still trying to cut through it, I suppose, given that evidence.
Well, it does strike me as something that has been implicit in what we've said is that you do have, let's say, in inverted commas, professional customers. So you have professionals who go in and they know what to say to get a discount or to get a refund or to get a free main course or to get whatever it is that they do, and they try it on and they hone their skills to do it. But I don't know many restaurants or cafes or whatever, to use your example, that train their staff in actually how to counter those kind of plays which are being made in a way that doesn't expose the other person, but also quite firmly puts on the other side of the story.
Yeah. And that kind of talks to what we do, doesn't it? I mean, this is, we do training on this kind of thing and helping people to certainly, I do a lot of stuff on communication. And that's a very central part, dealing with those difficult conversations that you have to have. And I do find that when we train staff how to do this, they have much more confidence. They're aware of the techniques that they can use. And I think that links back to this idea of when the customer is not right, then, deal with it in a professional way. And that's a good thing. So that's a great one to end on there. I think sort of brings it to full circle. So thanks so much, Jeremy, for being the first guest on this podcast. And maybe we'll see you again when this podcast has gone viral. And we've got Richard Branson on and other people as well.
And little old me. Well, thank you very much.
And you started it off. You were here at the beginning. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Jeremy.
Okay, so there we go, the very first episode of Terrible Business Advice. Hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, make sure that you subscribe so that you don't miss any future episodes. And if you really liked it, maybe you can leave us a review, but only of course if you really like it. Okay, thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you again soon on another episode of Terrible Business Advice. Bye-bye.